The US-Canada relationship has long been a model of economic and cultural partnership, built on the world's largest bilateral trade flow. But in the summer of 2025, this stability was shattered by a surge of nationalist economic policies. Donald Trump's return to the US presidency brought a renewed America First approach, putting existing trade agreements under threat. In Canada, new Prime Minister Mark Carney promised to resist isolationism, setting up a direct ideological clash. Tensions peaked when Canada introduced a digital services tax, sparking a fierce dispute with Washington. The standoff sent shockwaves through markets and forced both nations to reconsider the future of their partnership. The special relationship was being redefined in real time, with no guarantee it would survive unchanged. At the heart of the conflict was Canada's digital services tax, a 3% levy on revenues from Canadian users, targeting global tech giants. The tax was retroactive to 2022, creating immediate billion-dollar liabilities for companies like Google, Meta, and Amazon. Ottawa argued the DST was about fairness, ensuring foreign tech firms contributed to the Canadian economy. The move followed years of stalled international negotiations on digital taxation. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne called it a crucial step to modernize Canada's tax system. But the retroactive element was provocative, and US officials warned of retaliation. Despite the risks, Canada pressed ahead, underestimating the backlash from the Trump administration. The stage was set for a confrontation over tax sovereignty versus American corporate interests. Washington's response was immediate and forceful, sending a clear signal that the United States would not back down. The atmosphere in the capital shifted overnight as officials scrambled to address the escalating crisis. News outlets buzzed with speculation, and the world watched closely as tensions mounted between two of North America's closest allies. Just days before DST payments were due, President Trump abruptly terminated all trade talks with Canada, denouncing the tax as a direct attack on American interests. His words were sharp and uncompromising, leaving little room for negotiation or compromise. Trump's administration threatened swift retaliatory tariffs, matching the $2 billion Canada hoped to collect. The threat was not just symbolic, it was a promise of immediate action, designed to inflict real economic pain if Canada did not relent. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced a Section 301 investigation, a powerful tool that could pave the way for sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods. The move signaled that the U.S. was prepared to use every instrument at its disposal to protect its economic interests. The message was clear: the United States would not tolerate what it saw as discriminatory policies targeting American companies. Officials emphasized that this was about fairness and defending American workers. Trump's strategy was to isolate Canada on the world stage and force a quick capitulation, effectively slamming the door on further diplomacy. Behind closed doors, advisors debated the risks, but the president remained resolute. The shockwaves were felt across the political spectrum, with some lawmakers and business leaders applauding the administration's tough stance in defense of American business and sovereignty. Yet others, including seasoned diplomats and economic analysts, feared the long-term damage such a confrontation could inflict on the decades-old alliance, warning of unintended consequences for both economies. The hardline approach signaled a new era of aggressive U.S. trade policy, one that prioritized national interests above traditional partnerships and alliances. Canada now faced a stark and difficult choice: abandon the tax it had championed as a matter of principle and policy, or risk a damaging trade war that could upend the economic relationship between the two nations for years to come. Cornered by the threat of sweeping tariffs and the looming specter of a trade war, Canada found itself at a crossroads. The stakes were high, and the pressure from Washington was relentless. With trade talks grinding to a halt and diplomatic channels growing colder by the day, the Canadian government faced a stark dilemma: stand firm and risk economic turmoil, or seek a way out before irreparable damage was done. Prime Minister Carney's administration, already under intense scrutiny, was forced to confront the harsh reality of Canada's economic dependence on its southern neighbor. The Canadian economy, deeply reliant on U.S. access for both exports and imports, stood on the brink. Factories, ports, and entire industries faced uncertainty, with thousands of jobs hanging in the balance. Inside Ottawa, cabinet ministers debated late into the night. Could Canada afford to hold its ground, or was a tactical retreat the only way to protect its people and businesses? After days of intense deliberations, Carney announced the repeal of the digital services tax just before payments were due, a move that caught many by surprise. The decision was carefully framed as a strategic step to reopen negotiations with the U.S., not a capitulation. Carney insisted it was about keeping the door open for dialogue. Finance Minister Champagne echoed this message, stressing the urgent need to protect Canadian jobs, stabilize markets, and prevent a deeper economic crisis. The hope was to restart talks for a new, fairer trade framework, one that would secure Canada's interests without further escalation. This calculated retreat was a pragmatic gamble, a bid to save the broader relationship with the U.S. and avoid a full-blown economic crisis. Yet it also exposed the limits of Canada's leverage and the vulnerability of its economy to external shocks. For Carney, who had campaigned on an anti-Trump platform and promised a new era of independence, the reversal was a bitter pill. He was forced into a public climb-down, facing criticism from both political opponents and supporters who questioned his resolve. The episode left lingering doubts about Canada's ability to chart its own course in the face of U.S. pressure, and raised questions about the country's future direction. As the dust settled, one thing was clear: Canada's relationship with its powerful neighbor would never be the same. For the Trump administration, Canada's tax was blatant discrimination against U.S. tech giants. Treasury Secretary Bessent argued the DST targeted American firms while sparing Canadian ones, calling it protectionism in disguise. The retroactive nature of the tax was especially infuriating, creating sudden, massive liabilities for U.S. companies. The administration saw this as a dangerous precedent that could inspire similar moves worldwide. The Section 301 investigation provided legal cover for retaliatory tariffs, reinforcing the administration's tough stance. Bipartisan support in Washington for defending American tech was strong, even among critics of big tech at home. The alignment of political and corporate interests gave Trump a solid domestic footing. The pressure on Canada was intense and unrelenting, ensuring a swift Canadian retreat. The U.S.-Canada economic relationship is massive, over $760 billion in annual trade. This trade relationship is one of the largest in the world, reflecting the deep economic ties and mutual dependence between the two nations. With $2 billion crossing the border daily, the flow of goods and services is constant and vital. This daily exchange includes everything from raw materials to finished products, ensuring that both economies remain robust and interconnected. Canada is the top export market for U.S. goods, supporting millions of American jobs. American industries, from automotive to agriculture, rely heavily on Canadian markets to sustain their operations and growth. For Canada, the dependence is even greater. 3/4 of its exports go to the U.S. This heavy reliance means that any disruption in trade can have significant repercussions for the Canadian economy. The threat of tariffs risked catastrophic job losses and recession in Canada. The potential for economic downturn was a major concern for Canadian policymakers and businesses alike. The U.S. held immense leverage, and the $2 billion at stake in the DST dispute was minor compared to the broader economic risks. The power dynamics in trade negotiations often favored the U.S., given its larger economy and market size. The Carney government's decision to rescind the tax was a pragmatic recognition of these realities. It was a strategic move to preserve economic stability and avoid further escalation. The economic integration is so deep that disruption would hurt both sides, but Canada would suffer far more. The interdependence means that any barriers to trade can have ripple effects across various sectors. The numbers made the choice clear. Preserving the economic lifeline was paramount. Ensuring the smooth flow of trade between the U.S. and Canada remains a top priority for both nations, highlighting the importance of their economic partnership. The dispute was also a clash of leadership styles. Trump, the populist dealmaker, used public pressure and unpredictability to force concessions. Carney, the technocrat, tried to keep negotiations calm and principled, but found his approach ineffective against Trump's tactics. Their personal friction was evident, with Carney's appeals to partnership clashing with Trump's transactionalism. Trump's public threats and abrupt moves created chaos, leaving Carney little room to maneuver. In the end, Carney's pragmatic retreat was a concession to raw economic power. Trump won the political battle, forcing a public reversal from his Canadian counterpart. The episode highlighted the limits of traditional diplomacy in the face of aggressive, high-stakes tactics. The crisis was resolved quickly, but the scars remain. Canada's capitulation set a precedent, signaling that U.S. threats work. The Trump administration's aggressive tactics may now be used in future disputes, shifting the balance of power. For Canada, the challenge is to protect its interests while managing deep economic dependence on the U.S. The era of quiet diplomacy is over, replaced by volatility and confrontation. The next months will test whether the two nations can find a new equilibrium or face recurring disputes. The special relationship endures, but its character has fundamentally changed. Both countries must now navigate a more uncertain and challenging future.